Let me welcome everyone. Thank you for coming for this USC Center for Mindfulness Science keynote lecture by Dr. Joe Tafur. Joe and I go way back. On the relative scheme of things, way back. We met in September of '99, first day of med school. And have had a co-evolving journey in the space of spiritual healing ever since. It's really an honor to be able to host you here today, Joe. Thank you for being with us. Joe is not currently associated formally, I don't think, with any academic institutions.
University of Arizona, I do a little teaching there.
Yeah, so an adjunct appointment there with the Center for Integrative Medicine, and has been creating a unique path in medicine really since '99, but especially over the last 12 to 15 years. After graduating from UC San Diego School of Medicine in 2003, he did his internship at St. Joe's Hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, where he grew up, and then did the rest of his residency training in family medicine at UCLA. And after finishing his degree at UCLA, he came back to UCSD, where I was still toiling away on my long MD PhD journey to start a postdoc in the Department of Psychiatry with Dr. Paul Mills, studying psychoneuroimmunology, a 2-year fellowship. T32 NIH funded psychoneuroimmunology fellowship, behavioral medicine. And during that time, deepened his curiosity, interest, engagement with psychedelic therapy, about which he will be telling us much today, which included a lot of visits to a series of shamans in Peru. And towards the end of that 2-year period, decided that it really was a calling for him to pursue a fellowship of sorts in shamanic healing with a Shipibo shaman by the name of Ricardo Amaringo. He got some money together and started a spiritual healing center outside of Iquitos, Peru, called Niue Rao, and spent the next 6 years primarily living there in the jungle in Peru and assisting Ricardo and the other shamans at that center with their healing work and apprenticing with Ricardo until such time as Ricardo told him he knew what he needed to know to do that work himself. So since around 2016-17, when that happened, he's been doing that work wherever people were in need of healing and asking for help, and wrote a book, some copies of which are right here, about that whole journey, The Fellowship of the River, and started a church and a nonprofit organization called Modern Spirit. Modern Spirit was partly begun in order to fund a research project that I collaborated with him on as a PI here at USC, the Modern Spirit Epigenetics Project, looking at the epigenetic correlates to MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD in association with the big MAPS clinical trial that was conducted over the last 6-7 years. And the Church of the Eagle and the Condor, which I think was begun in 2018, has been engaged with a prolonged, protracted battle with the DEA, and that has ended up over the last few days in a DEA license being issued to the church and to Joe to work with ayahuasca for healing purposes.
Woo!
Legally within the United States.
Can we get on that license too for all?
We can try.
We can try. One noteworthy thing about that, besides, its noteworthiness in and of itself. The press release just went out this morning for the first time, is that it's the first church that has been given permission to use ayahuasca that is not a Christian church. The first church in America has been given that permission by the DEA to use ayahuasca without a Christian context. And without further ado, I'll let you take it away, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you, Rael. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I guess I'll stand up, maybe sit down in front of my computer. I don't know. Just a few of us here. I'm gonna sit down on my computer so I can see you and talk to you. Yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for being here. Yeah, today's the day. Today, happy Earth Day. It's Earth Day today for whoever's interested. And that is, we decided that would be the primary holiday of the Church of the Eagle and the Condor. So we announced it today. Last week, we received the DEA exemption. So this is my talk. Rael and I have been talking for a long time. I'm familiar. I'm part of the epigenetics project that was run here at the lab, and familiar and talked to Jonas and a little bit with some of the neuroscience work that's been going on here. Very interested in those topics myself. And so then I've been kind of going around speaking about spiritual healing in psychedelic psychotherapy. That's what I'm talking to you about today. Rael told you about my background and everything. So that's all there. I'm trying to get out of this Zoom. I don't have to answer any chats or questions, right? Somebody else will do that.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah, I did the everything he talked about. We brought it up here. So just to get started, this is when we first opened Anywhere Rael. He talked about in 2011 we opened our doors there in the jungle, and we didn't have even a roof to cook ayahuasca. We just cook it outside, and that's how. I don't know if you know what ayahuasca is. Ayahuasca is sacred plant medicine that has psychedelic properties, right, from the Amazonian traditions. So one of the ancient ancestral traditions that have been working with psychedelic substances or sacred plant medicines for forever. Bill Richards is, that's who's down there, Bill Richards, one of the major people involved in kind of the trailing end of the last wave of psychedelic psychotherapeutic research. He had this quote, that he said, and this is from Michael Pollan's book, if you go deep enough and far out enough into consciousness, you will bump into the sacred. It's not something we generate. It's something out there waiting to be discovered. And this reliably happens to believers as well as non-believers. This is this issue to deal with. I lectured over at, let's try to stand up, at MAPS last year, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, and they put me in a workshop with this group from Atlanta, from Emory University. These guys published their paper 2023. With this,
Roman will be speaking for us next month. Yes.
Wonderful. Yeah, he's I keep running into him. He's like, I run into him there, I run into him at Berkeley. So there, his publication, this one, spiritually, existentially, religiously, or theologically relevant experiences are common in psychedelic assisted therapy, the CERT, they call it the CERT. And furthermore, such CERT experiences are clinically relevant. This idea of, okay, we're bumping into the sacred, how do we address it? Spiritual discussion is a little delicate matter to talk about. Why should we talk about it? Well, it's clinically relevant, actually. Like what people are finding from this kind of treatment and this kind of work, which is this common CERT experience, is making a big impact in the kind of healthcare results that we're seeing. So they're clinically relevant, so to healthcare outcomes, and this should be integrated into the therapy model. Then in their paper, they talk about, okay, there's these CERTs. So then, well, how do you assist somebody through a CERT? If we're doing therapy for people and having people go through these experiences, who's qualified to hold space for such a thing? And so in their paper, they recommended this spiritually integrated psychotherapy at this new field that has this, function to draw upon diverse spiritual traditions and psychological research to provide practical, usable resources to help therapists integrate spirituality into their work. So it's not the therapist, how they are going to elicit and make therapeutic use of their own, of the client's spiritual perspectives and their own, ethically. So this idea is everyone has a different kind of spiritual experience, but we're going to have to deal with it. We're going to have to address it. And that's going to come up in their clinical process. So then I asked the question, this is a master plant from the Amazonian tradition, Bominsana. So down there in the jungle, to learn about helping people through CERTs, you train with plants. Very different system, but that is the training. And so this is one of the teacher plants, Bominsana. So there it is. And so I said, well, how will science integrate spirituality? You know, how I said, well, probably acronyms, you know, it's usually goes every time I've seen. Yeah, as soon as we have the acronym, I'm sure it'll be quite commonplace to discuss these things.
Joe, before you move on, could you give us your quick interpretation or your understanding of what is you define as spirituality?
Yes,
Please
I,
have me read.
I have it down
Oh,
later in the talk, if that's all right. I would say that, well, let's just jump
I
to.
don't want to
Yeah,
change.
I'm gonna get to it, so that's a good question, you know, and so that I'm just using it loosely, and then I'll give you kind of a version of this, so anyways. Within these traditions, you know, there's not, like, you know, I work here, Church of the Eagle and the Condor is related to indigenous traditions here, you know, this idea of spirit and they're, the way they talk about it in the Amazon, like it's a very wide term, I guess we could define it further, but you know, people do have an idea, I guess, of what people are talking about. You know, so I'll give you a little clearer definition on my part. At this center in Peru, where it's called Niuerao Centro Espiritual, meaning spiritual center, that's how the title of the center. In Iquitos, Peru, there in the jungles where we do all this work, ceremonial healing, the healing work that's done there, you know, which is akin in a way to the psychedelic psychotherapy work is regarded to be spiritual practice. There's no distinction in the tradition, in the ancestral tradition, they would see what psychedelic psychotherapy, what they're doing as a form of spiritual practice, like directly in line with the continued cultural experience. Although, of course, there are, you know, language distinctions to address. However, what's going on is not considered different from what they've been doing for so long. And so these peoples, you know, at the time of meeting the Westerners, you know, why did they explore this? What are they doing with these master plans and working with ayahuasca? They're doing it for spiritual healing. They're doing to deepen spiritual connection and to find inner guidance. You know, we'll try to like address those terms a little bit further as we go. Here's a native woman from Arizona, Rainbow Lopez. And so she's involved and was part of a recent publication. And so this discussion of like, okay, therapy in her interpretation as an indigenous person becomes the intellectual explanation of trauma to justify the healing. But what do we do with it? That there's an energetic side to things. There's some dynamic, there's something that needs to happen. So ceremony creates the environment and the circumstance to affect the healing. You know, that's still there. But there's still something to be moved, there's something to change. And that's coming from experience of what we're talking about. We're not just talking about the abstraction of someone getting better, when someone actually gets better, what happens to them? So this idea of the energetics of the whole situation and the whole system, you know, are very, you know, they're quite okay to talk about in the Amazon, for example. It's celebrated in the culture throughout. That we have to address this stuff and it's there. And that by addressing this stuff, we create an opportunity perhaps to facilitate healing. So when you look at the more recent research, this is psilocybin assisted psychotherapy, I think from NYU, they're beginning to track their alcohol use disorder study. And they're saying, okay, you know, I know Rael was talking about this last week and it's a hot topic, psychedelic psychotherapy, but as they look at these people trying to come out of alcohol use disorders, they say, well, you know, it's not just the mystical experience. That wasn't really the only thing. It wasn't about how mystical they got. Just as salient from what they're bringing were experiences of catharsis, experiences of forgiveness, experiences of self-compassion and love. Like that was the key, that the people that were going through those kind of experiences that some people would traditionally relate to spiritual tradition or work. In other words, before psychotherapy, people previously went to the clergy or to different religious resources to go through assistance in dealing with catharsis, forgiveness, self-compassion, and self-love. So this is, you know, some stuff, some data that's been coming out. And that was kind of my experience that, you know, I wrote about in the book that's here, is just, the book is my experience as a family medicine doctor, going down to the Amazon and living at the center, working with people and watching people heal through the kind of problems that me as a family medicine doctor, you know, trained at UCLA, that I knew we didn't know how to help people with. And yet I saw people have some pretty rapid turnarounds with certain kinds of illnesses. And so it was like, well, what was so special about what they did there in 10 days or in 2 weeks or in a few months? How did they achieve that? And it was really about finding a system of medicine that was going to address this emotional dimension of illness and treatment, and also the spiritual dimension, for whatever it's worth. We still have to get into that term. So I created this little image based on the book, and an online course we have about the book, which is connecting this, here's the Shipibo healer on this side and the spiritual metaphysical kind of version of how things are operating, all the way to this material allopathic side. We run into these topics that are hot topics right now in mental health: trauma, stress, allostatic load, epigenetics, even something like neurogenic inflammation, and showing how within the tradition, they're saying that we deal with somebody energetically, spiritually, as they would call it. And then that helps us access them emotionally. And that the healing is going to happen at the physical level, like at the emotional level. And that the emotional body, the emotional biology that would be affected both by trauma and similarly by trauma healing would manifest in something like the psychoneuroendocrine immunologic network, okay, the PNEI network. So then you would show, we could measure, changes happening physically in that system in response to what would be considered an emotional healing or a spiritual healing. And that in the old ways of this kind of thing, and the book talks about, which is why I brought up the other slide, that really I said, what happened to these people? Yeah, I guess some of them had a mystical experience, some of them had this, but really each one of them went through some journey into forgiveness or self-love or compassion or gratitude. That was my experience. That's what I came up with as like a summary of what I watched in these cases. And then that's what these guys are saying from NYU. So Paul Mills, who was my research mentor, and Morale brought him up over at UCSD, who, exploring forgiveness as a concept that you could approach secular, that's coming deep within a lot of spiritual traditions. In this case, I'm referring to spiritual, I mean Christian practice. Okay, I'm talking about Judeo-Christian practice in this example, like forgiveness, the way that many people have learned about it through, whether that's Jesus Christ or other forms of Judeo-Christian teachings about the role of forgiveness. So spiritual in the sense that it's rooted in this religious practice, thousands of years old. So Paul Mills back in 2002 was very interested in looking at, religion, religiosity, and health in the early days of the internet, as that intersected with spirituality and health, just looking for ways that it popped up. And this guy, Kevin Master, in 2000 followed up on this, same thing. Let's just look at these names, these terms, and, we're just learning how to use the internet and compare and see what we can get. And they said, they started to elucidate this idea: forgiveness may be thought of as a mechanistic construct, similar perhaps to compassion, that potentially bridges the secular spiritual divide. That forgiveness is something that psychologists accept as a concept that is useful in people's therapeutic process. That's also has a big, spiritual or religious history behind it. So the idea is that this is there at the interface, at the secular divide. There might be something universal here. Compassion, we can go, we were here at the mindfulness neuroscience, the mindfulness science, center. So we have the Tibetan Buddhists, what do they say about this compassion? Well, this is one example, Chagan Trungpa. Compassion becomes a bridge to the world outside. Trust and compassion for oneself bring inspiration to dance with life, to communicate with the energies of the world. So the tradition talks about these energies of the world, this life, this living thing that we're part of. And if we look at this new take on what's going on with MDMA research, with MAPS, and what were some of the breakthroughs? So Bessel van der Kolk, this famous trauma researcher, now he's poring over the research, trying to say, what can we, dig out of there and data mine from what the changes that we're seeing, these transformational healings that have been observed in the MDMA assisted therapy trial for PTSD. And they said, it's a problem with emotional regulation is what's kind of really stopping people in their PTSD treatment. And so MDMA, may be particularly effective for enhancing treatment efficacy by improving a range of problems with self-experience that are associated with treatment resistance, namely this alexithymia, their ability to recognize and verbalize their emotions, and their access to self-compassion. That these things are seen as blocks in treatment, and that if we can help them get over this, then maybe people that are stuck in PTSD, maybe they have a chance to respond to therapy that previously they could not. And that would involve a shift in their emotional regulation of their body, body and mind. So self-love, self-compassion, if we look at it from a more secular perspective, compassion, means simply this. It's not, again, it's a concept that you don't have to be religious or spiritual to discuss compassion. It's this idea of suffering together or being able to, the feeling that arises with another suffering, or your ability to hold space for your own suffering, self-compassion. You know, in the traditions, like in the indigenous traditions here in the United States, here we are in USA, they call that like rejoining the sacred. That you have that compassion to yourself to exist, to belong, to be part of all that is. So they would say that you're walking somebody through a process where they're gonna be able to shift their emotional processing, where they're gonna be able to find more compassion for themselves. They're saying you're helping them reconnect. That's an indigenous perspective. Another one is this one. This is a Mexican indigenous person, Mendahi Bastido, has a new book, and so he's trying to teach their wisdom.
I apologize.
So
Just muted. I'm trying to.
Here we go.
Got it?
Yes.
So he says, our ancestors tell us how to live in sacred connection. That's how he described it. For this, it's important to feel beautifully. It's necessary to think beautifully, but it's much more significant to connect beautifully. That's actually something. That's actually a process that's identified. Through that connection, you remember who you are, you know who you are, you celebrate who you are, and then he goes on to describe, who they believe that you are. This cosmic essence. So this connectedness is showing itself in this psychedelic psychotherapy research. The connectedness scale that's now been published, I guess, in 2022, where they're trying to look at, cross-referencing. If we look at these questions about the mystical experience, or what were the different subjective experiences that made such a difference clinically, that you could show if they shifted on this scale, then we could say probably that psychotherapeutic, that psychedelic psychotherapeutic intervention is going to make a difference. They're going to get better from their anxiety. They're going to get better from their depression or from their PTSD, for example, or addiction. They're saying, hey, this connectedness scale is looking pretty comprehensive. They're developing this connectedness scale, and so they have this, this big online study, 2 big online studies, and then also have this double-blind randomized controlled trial with psilocybin assisted therapy, and they kind of said, well, significant post-psychedelic increases were observed for total connectedness, as well as on each of the subscales, acute measures of mystical experience, emotional breakthrough, and communitas, this other term, perceived togetherness and shared humanity, correlated positively with post-psychedelic changes in connectedness. So this idea that connectedness is not just this concept that this indigenous wisdom keeper is talking about, but it has clinical relevance. So gratitude is gratitude. I'm not going to define gratitude, but we're aware of gratitude and gratefulness and grace, connected to that spiritual concept or religious concept. One way to describe that, but something that people have been exploring in terms of spiritual practice. Paul Mills went on, after we hung out with him at UCSD, he went on to work for Deepak and be the research director for Deepak Chopra. And Paul had done all this work in psychoneuroimmunology and working on heart failure patients. They had a big pool of patients at UCSD. So they had some people to investigate around, the role of gratitude in spiritual well-being and in asymptomatic heart failure. So now spiritual well-being in this case is defined by a questionnaire that I'll touch on one of them. There's several spiritual well-being questionnaires that are now being validated in the literature. So these are the concepts. That's the language that we're talking about. So they're saying you can show an association between gratitude, between spiritual well-being, and then all these other, physical manifestations in these heart failure patients. And they said gratitude was associated with better sleep, less depressed mood, less fatigue, better self-efficacy, and also lower levels of inflammatory biomarkers. So this is very physical stuff that we're talking about, very health related. What do they do what's the gratitude scale that they use that is correlated or can be linked to these inflammatory biomarkers? It's as simple as these questions. These are the questions. I have so much in my life to be thankful for. I'm grateful to a wide variety of people, and what you see here and how they score on that is going to help indicate, could be correlated to their health, their physical health, how well they sleep, what is the status of inflammation in the body. So the idea is that spiritual well-being, and we have to define it still, but we're making our way there. Spiritual well-being manifests in emotional health. And so that is the very easy way to bridge the divide between the Shipibo healers and here the neuroscientists. we can examine the emotional health and the associated biology of the emotional health. So a very obvious example of something that's sitting at the center of what I would call the emotional body, the psychoneuroendocrine immunologic network, is the HPA axis. You know, it's cortisol level fluctuations, HPA axis. We know that HPA axis is disturbed by heavy emotional trauma. That's no one questions that. We know that when people heal from PTSD in the MDMA trial, that we would anticipate that their HPA axis function would improve. That would be part of the evidence that they actually got better. If we look at what Rael is interested in investigating, you know, like how do we support, you know, how can we get more out of psychedelic assisted therapy? What if we draw upon spiritual traditions, or what if we draw upon practices that would support that? The way the Shipibos down in the Amazon, it's like, yes, you should bring a lot of spiritual practice and ceremony and mindfulness to working with people in those states. You're going to have a more effective result. That's the traditional experience. So they run this study, Ron Griffiths, you know, and his group before he passed away, looking at psilocybin, occasion mystical type experience in combination with meditation and other spiritual practices. So they created those subgroups. You know, you have the high dose group that has standard support of spiritual practice. In this case, they describe what that is, and I think I'll get to that. The standard, which consisted of meditation book plus 5 hours meditation and spiritual training with an experienced guide. That's standard. And then they had high, you know, the higher dose of psilocybin was the high dose, but then with more extensive support, face-to-face time with their guides. This continued for 4 months after the second dose of psilocybin. This includes taking part in twice monthly 90-minute group dialogue sessions and journaling. So that's this higher level spiritual practice. That's how they define it, according to their
Joe, can
Yes.
I make a comment about
Yes.
this? I think it might be misquoted here. My memory of this paper, I consulted a lot in the preparation of our
Right.
IRB.
Yes.
Was that actually the standard support didn't include the spiritual practice. It just was.
It included this.
Oh, just 5
Just this.
hours.
Just that was the standard support that they received. Then you have the high dose, they got high dose with standard support and high dose with high support.
In both cases, they got the same high dose. It was just the more supportive versus the less supportive.
Correct.
Engagement with the.
There was
spiritual
also a lower
practice.
dose group.
Yeah.
That was compared.
Yeah.
So as they did all that and did the comparisons, you know, you did see, okay, the high dose was significant. But adding the higher level of spiritual practice was significant as well. You know, that just is a separate determinant of enduring effects. So it wasn't just a mystical experience, it wasn't just a high dose experience. If you created this more spiritual practice as they define it and what they have walked people through, they saw improvement in all these areas and more improvement in the people that had the more extended spiritual support and measured along these measures.
Joe, how do you define a high versus a low dose? What's the criteria?
They have
you use?
they have it here. So their high dose was 20 to 30 milligrams per 70 kilogram person. The low dose is 1 milligram per.
And so what is that based on then? Is it behavior? Is it?
That's their
track
experience.
record? How would you say this is called a high dose? This is not. I mean, pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic.
From
behavioral-
subjective result
Yeah.
of the person, that's how.
Okay,
So in other words, they say if you give somebody 1 milligram per kilogram, that's a medium, that's a lower dose. And if we give them 20 to 30 milligrams at that weight, then that would be, so that's literally, it's as simple as the amount that they're giving them. And yes, the idea is how subjectively, how many of them have a mystical experience, many more of them in that high dose range. Maybe in the lower dose range, they didn't quite hit that area as often.
yeah, is there a ceiling effect? Because I have some people I know that a gram is what they consider, and I'm like, whoa, actually, that may be.
That's
psilocybin, yeah.
mushroom.
Mushroom, yes, okay, sorry, yeah.
It's a different scale.
Right.
1
but-
gram.
But you know
is a-
what I'm getting at, right, is the idea of what's the ceiling, what's the trajectory of what we consider high, low, medium? Could you overdose and become too spiritual? Could you overdose and
Sure,
become too
yes.
opening?
Yeah,
Yeah. Or get psychotic?
sure, yes.
Yeah.
You know, but not psychotic, permanently psychotic or destabilized psychotic from the experience of the clinical research that's out there. We could say you could see a destabilization of somebody with a prior history of bipolar and mania or schizophrenia and psychosis. You do see that risk. in somebody with no prior history of that, you know, do you see people go into prolonged destabilizations, maybe for a few hours, maybe for a period of time, but not permanently? And that's, I mean, that's what's out there right now in the clinical research data. So the fears around that people brought up, which are real concerns, but the clinical data does not demonstrate that. If you screen out, which is what they do for these studies, people with a prior history of psychosis or prior history of mania, they're not running into those problems. Even in a higher dose on a naive person who, you know, may be extra sensitive personally and may blow them away. So there's that. So then back to my thing, spiritual well-being manifests in emotional health, affecting both mental and physical health. And I'll touch on a little bit on the epigenetics study that we participated in here, that Raul was running. But just getting back to this emotional stuff. So a separate line, I talked about the connectedness scale, and they mentioned this, that this emotional breakthrough inventory. So that it's not enough to have a mystical experience, and it's not necessarily necessary for you to have a mystical experience for this healing to occur. And so the evidence is really about from the MDMA research. So in the MDMA research, they're not saying on these MDMA doses at the doses that they're using, or in general, this is kind of ego dissolution and loss of sense of space and time. And that's not happening for those people. Okay, yet they're having these dramatic transformations in their healing. And it turns out that they were able to show that it was due to emotional breakthrough. How do they measure that? It's a simple questionnaire set of these questions right here. You know, I had an emotional breakthrough at the end of the scale of the question. I felt able to explore challenging emotions and memories. I achieved an emotional release. So this idea, now we're getting into this felt sense somatic experience of life. You know, that happens in the body. The emotions are experienced through the body.
What's the name of the scale again?
An emotional breakthrough inventory.
Yeah.
This is Robin Carhart Harris and those guys. So then another body of researchers, my friend Adele LaFrance and her group was trying to look at this because people see, oh, there's just like this pan diagnostic effect that they're saying, well, we can use these kind of things. We can, it's MDMA or it's psilocybin or it's ketamine or it's, let's just start with those across a variety of illnesses. You know, anxiety, depression, PTSD, eating disorder, which from a family medicine doctor, that, you know, those people are going to different resources. And yet those people are having big transformational healings, you know, some of the reported data. This is a community sample. So then they were trying to figure out what changed for these people. If we look at the people that got better across a big community sample, what changed? And they found that the people that improved clinically were the people that had shifts in emotional processing. That was the common link, according to an emotional processing questionnaire scale that they have. Then they use their statistics to look a little bit deeper. What's driving the shift in emotional processing? According to the statistics, what can we demonstrate that everyone that had the shift in emotional processing also had this? And it was a shift in spiritual well-being. According to this questionnaire, the World Health Organization, spirituality, religious, and personal beliefs, 32-item questionnaire. They ask questions like, to what extent do you find meaning in life? So that's what they're talking about when they talk about spiritual and this evidence-based setting. To what extent do you feel inner spiritual strength? People's response to that kind of question, if they do better on this scale, shifts in score of this questionnaire as a result of psychedelic intervention appear to drive improvements in emotional processing, which then drive mental health symptom improvement. That's what some of the data is showing.
A quick question, Joe.
Yeah.
So the previous paper was saying the ego dissolution type spiritual experiences weren't necessarily drivers of.
That they can be
emotional-
drivers,
They
that they
can
can
be.
be drivers,
But
but they're
is
not the
this something
only
that-
driver.
Is this saying something different, or are we now differentiating between ego dissolutive spiritual?
We're saying that the shift in spiritual well-being, which may not require
Gotcha,
ego dissolution,
gotcha.
okay? So if they achieved a shift in spiritual well-being according to the questionnaire, whether or not. So then we get back to the connectedness scale that we talked about before. So now we're looking at these more holistic scales. So this is just to let people know this is the scale, these are the questions. This is connectedness that's having this clinical relevance. So connectedness, according to this, to self, to others, to the world. And here's the different, you know, I felt connected to a range of emotions, self. I felt trapped in my mind. Connectedness to others, I feel connected to a community, to the world. I feel connected to nature. I feel connected to a purpose in life. So that's connectedness from an evidence-based kind of discussion. that, you know, somebody like this, the Mexican wisdom keeper, I would say that they would consider that a spiritual scale. So then the MDMA research, you know, is making these big waves, and it's part of the reason we're here at the university talking about this kind of stuff. And so here they are, New York Times, this year, supposedly in the United States, in August is when they're going to FDA approve MDMA assisted psychotherapy. So we'll be here, yes.
The previous questionnaire, which was it?
That's the connectedness.
What's
What I
your
just showed you was the
Yeah.
connectedness scale.
Watts
I
connect.
went back,
Watts.
the watts,
Okay.
yeah, I went, they kind of mixed it in there,
Okay.
kind of go around. It was a little poetic placement. It was a risk, I took a risk there. I was just walking you back to the connectedness scale. So if we look at what's happening with the MDMA research that's now going to be FDA approved later this year, and how that's affecting things that'll happen at the medical school, and how it's affecting medical training, and the way these concepts, whether they're spiritual or however we address them, are starting to make their way into treatment protocols. That is like standard. Currently, you have to go through the MAPS training to offer MDMA assisted psychotherapy, at least later this year. This is language from the thing that is kind of relevant, related to things we were talking about before. Empathic presence includes providing a non-judgmental environment which offers psychological permission to talk openly and honestly. It requires listening beneath and beyond the spoken words for deeper meanings. Okay, so beyond the words, the deeper meanings, acknowledging the other suffering, validating her or his feelings. It's essential to encourage the participant to trust her or his inner healing intelligence, which is a person's innate capacity to heal the wounds of trauma. It is important to highlight the fact that the participant is the source of his or her own healing. So this is now going to be established, you know, medical training, evidence-based, making the difference, you know, for PTSD that other treatments are not.
Can I just make a comment on that MAPS page? And I work in a modern tradition of psychospiritual psychotherapy. And we find it's actually quite dangerous to tell people the strong ego identification that that I is the source of its own healing, because that I is not the source of its own healing. There's a deeper I that
Well,
is-
their idea is a deeper I. I think if you
Right.
go through the training and you learn more about what they're providing, I think it's a deeper I that they're reaching for. I would say I don't have any
Okay.
question about that in talking to
Okay.
those people training and learning the therapy.
Well, that makes me
You
feel
could,
a little
people
better.
spin off into that,
Right.
you know, but that's not the goal. So they're saying deeper meaning innate healing intelligence, they're saying something deeper. And so this, you know, now that I was saying that language reminded me of ceremony down in Peru, where
Yeah.
people could run away with their egos and be narcissists and, you know, claim all this thing and get confused. So the proof is in the pudding. You know, they can tell you, oh, I know better, I know best. Well, if they're not getting better, they're not connected.
Yeah, I'm
You
really talking about people with a very deflated ego, not a narcissistic ego,
Right,
but people who've tried all sorts of healing.
right.
And then you tell them that ego identification is the source of their healing, and they go looking for the healing in that.
Well, I don't know how they phrase it. In my case, I don't mean it as an ego identification.
Gotcha.
We're talking about a deeper part of ourselves.
It's kind of like little s and big S.
Sure, you know, all the words, all the terms, you know, that everybody wants to run circles around, but then the beauty is, well, see who gets better and who doesn't get better.
Sure.
That's really what we're talking about. You know, and so then this person wants to explain to me, I know how to do it, I know how to talk about it. I know, okay, well, let's see how the people are doing. Down there in the jungle, they don't have that, description of what they're doing. You know, it's not a big purpose as far as what they're like, what do I mean is what just happened. They don't talk about those terms. So I said there, when it was reminding me of that, of being in the jungle, saying, okay, there's a deeper meaning here beyond the words, you know, which is one of the things that they mentioned in the MAPS training, that we're looking for that. And that there is something innate within ourselves beyond the ego that maybe is part of our natural wholeness that could help guide us. And so that's this idea of this inner healer, this inner healing intelligence, which, you know, I think it's important to bring up what you brought up, but I think it is distinct from the ego. And so I don't think that's what they're talking about. That's not my impression. So this inner healer that's now raising itself up in this therapy medical model, but it's also been kind of a big part of the spiritual ceremony of connecting into a deeper essence. So how do they talk about that in indigenous terms to frame it, like another way to flesh out how to think about it? And it's, you know, they call right relationship. So that right relationship with yourself, with your loved ones, with your community, with your society, with your ecosystem, with your universe, is what the goal is. And that's the goal of spiritual path and growth. And that is actually, they would say that is what health is. And so then again, it's not about trying to sell somebody on what you believe and this is all I'm doing. No, it's like you should be healthier in your relationship with yourself and your personal intimate relationships. You should see the change, that's what we're aiming for. So spiritual in my discussion refers to the individual's relationship with the sacred. This is a version, this is one idea, with the sacred, with the non-ordinary aspects of life, which include the interconnectedness of all things. This would be just one version of a term to try to describe this. Sacred, could be something that's very personally meaningful. Sacred could just mean that in a very secular sense, like this is sacred to me, the LA Lakers are sacred to me, or something like that. Very personally meaningful. In a further sense, in a different sensibility, where somebody's going to talk about something beyond, something more transpersonal. You would be like, hey, this is, I have reverence for this because I believe this to be, have some kind of divine nature. There's something bigger here, and this non-ordinary thing that I'm in contact with, and this interconnected of all things. And there's a lot of room for confusion there, of course. So once again, we need some kind of structure. What is the structure? I would say health is the structure. That's how we can discern if this is in alignment or if it is not. So then spirituality becomes the subjective experience of the sacred, or our relationship with it. Now it goes far to say how it feels, how it moves in your body, really kind of grounding it into the experience. So sacred healing ceremony, or spiritual healing as it's practiced in places like Peru, is about healing that relationship to the sacred, or our subjective experience of the sacred. And so that's how they talk about it. That's how we talk, the indigenous people here as well. This is how they talk about it. Feeling connected to our sacred essence and to everything, the interconnectedness of all things, feeling aligned with our sacred essence, to the inner healer as it's described, the MAPS discussion. In Arizona, where I live, the Navajo, the Diné people, they say, Hojo, walking in beauty, to be walking in beauty, to feel yourself in alignment with the cosmos, with your body, with the people around you, and with the nature in which you're participating in. So in those traditions, healing and spiritual growth are paths to wholeness. So we're talking about wholeness. Therapy can similarly be healing and lead to spiritual growth. And so back to this chart, so I say, in the old times in Peru, or still today, you go to the Onañas, the Shipibo name for the ayahuasquero. So you go to that person when you're trying to work through this forgiveness, self-love, compassion, gratitude, to try to work through trauma, stress, allostatic load. That's who you go to, that healer. Then for many years, people would go to the clergy. Now it's a psychologist or psychiatrist is where people are going. Now they're going to the psychedelic psychotherapist, to address these issues. Psyche, a lot of people talk mind, manifesting mind, but in Greek, as far as I understand, psyche means soul. That's like a big connotation, a little departure. So sacred ceremony and psychedelic assisted therapy, they profoundly impact our emotional health and the associated physiology. That's the connection point between what's happening in the MDMA trial and what we're doing in Peru. So they are strengthened by spiritual practice, or, if we want to do, we could call it a secular approach. We could say mindfulness is secular and has nothing to do with spirituality, or however you want to describe it. Or a gratitude journal is not spiritual, it's just a gratitude journal, psychological. That's fine, but you could strengthen and bolster these experiences with those kind of secular practices, or even rooting them in some kind of spiritual tradition. So spiritual well-being then, as measured by these measures that I'm talking about, the validated measures I presented, manifests in emotional health. And that's a traditional understanding. That the person who's spiritually well, their emotional processing is versatile. They're not easily triggered emotionally, by the environment. So spiritual practice, all forms of spiritual practice then are basically to nourish our spiritual well-being, and their forms of spiritual healing. And spiritual healing is a spiritual practice, according to the tradition, that I'm coming from. So they say they would put psychedelic psychotherapy in the same category, profoundly impacting our emotional health and the associated physiology. So in that sense, in the traditions, songs are referred to as medicine because they have this capacity. Love is referred to as medicine for the same reason. Prayer is considered medicine. Meditation is considered medicine as well as a spiritual practice because of its effect on the emotional well-being. Similarly, ceremonies, medicine, and therapy would be regarded as medicine in the traditional sense of the indigenous sense. So here's Richard Ibn Schultes, one of the first like Western academicians from Harvard, hanging out with masters in Colombia, Amazonian masters, learning from them. And we're starting to see research happening in Peru with the Shipibos, the centers around like where I worked. They are beginning to study not just clinicized versions of working with ayahuasca, or trying to figure out how to put ayahuasca in the clinic, but letting, so-called shamans, traditional healers run their ceremony, how they do, create the context, how they would like to create it, and observe and watch people, Western people, not their own people. Not that it's about the cosmovision of you don't believe in it, it doesn't work on you. No, people from other countries from here go sit in Shipibo ayahuasca ceremony and go through their traditional form and put them through the scales and see how they do. And they say, well, indigenous people healing work with ayahuasca has value to improve long-term well-being and quality of life for Westerners. Like this is starting to be demonstrated through these scales that are now being published. So this is the modern version of Richard Ibn Schultes. This is Niwera, with Shipibos interacting with a French, young healer and a Canadian learning from the teachers. And so in their research and their publication where they study this group of people and followed them out, this psychological well-being, subjective well-being, spiritual well-being, quality of life after the retreat, they pulled out some stuff. They said, well, since LSD or mushrooms are not usually used in a ritual context, they mean in the Western, setting, these results lead us to consider the role of the ceremony and the positive and long-term impact on the well-being of Western people. They go a step further, talking about this cert stuff that we started the conversation. This idea of like, who's trained to hold somebody through a cert? Down there, it's a very advanced training in the jungle. And they say, when you put somebody through this really advanced training, sure, you could just have the substance or whatever, reduce it to nothing. But they said 36% of the people in their study that all these significant results said the Shipibo healers were the most important factor in the improvement, more than the ayahuasca experience. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge role there for the healer in this developing field. They have ketamine. This is a ketamine molecule. This is my art from going through ketamine for the first time at a training retreat. And I had the experience of, and I was like, wow, this is a big opening. This is a big opening. This ketamine is a very interesting opening. I could see its relationship to the other stuff. It's a different receptor site, it's different, but then, you still have this default mode network effect. You still have this brain entropy changes. They're very relevant. You still see this neuroplastic window open up, very similar, and its effects. Shorter, maybe, overall. But when I went through that, I said, well, this is really open. This is much different than ayahuasca or some plant medicine where maybe there'd be some kind of guide experience from that. The ketamine was just neutral, wide open cosmos. I said, well, this would be really interesting. What if you brought ceremonial techniques to that? So then we started doing that, and we have our sacred ceremony and psychedelic therapy retreats we do in Arizona, where we have traditional people, Wirarica, medicine person from a tradition that's from peyote tradition in Mexico, Navajos that work with peyote that supervise. And we do live singing, from ayahuasca ceremony during the ketamine experience with healthcare providers. And we've seen it just be very, very impactful. Just very interesting to bring these elements together. So it's a setting where the spirituality along the ways that I've tried to describe are just openly invited. In indigenous traditions, they see that more of a universal concept. Like we're talking about the nature of the universe. Now we're talking about a belief system. We're saying there's something about matter and time and energy and consciousness that have a mystical quality that has been, basically demonstrated. And we live it. So psychedelic assisted therapy can profoundly impact our emotional health and associated physiology through shifts in our spiritual well-being. That's what some of the evidence seems to indicate. That's the experience around the tradition. According to the ancestral tradition, spirituality and health are the same thing. That they're in fact about this relationship. That's what it is. So you can show if people are getting better in their relationship and their connectedness scale, how they connect to themselves, to their community, to the universe, you show their health is going to improve. That's the traditional kind of understanding. So this scale in this world, and this finishing up here, that, the study that we ran with Rael here at USC, the epigenetics study, Modern Spirit Epigenetics Project, was inspired by experiences in the ceremony in the Amazon, at least on my part. Many other people were interested in this kind of work. But to be so inspired and to raise the money privately to fund the study involved, writing the book and pushing the ideas around in the book and getting enough money to fund the study here at USC to look at, this epigenetics factor. That, okay, if in fact emotional biology or some molecular biology is responding to the emotional dimension of healing or even the spiritual dimension of healing, we should be able to measure it somewhere. All these subjective scales are really changing, but this PTSD shift in the MAP study is transformational. Like these people have 20 years on average of treatment-resistant chronic PTSD, and now they don't qualify for PTSD by criteria. Something major shifted in their body. So we should be able to track that. That was the idea, that was the concept. So we went to MAPS and asked them if they would let us collect saliva on people and track it. And so we did that. We published it last year with Rael here, based at USC. And it was a small study interrupted by COVID. So we only got 23 people, something like that in the study. Yeah, 23. And so you think, oh, we're never going to find anything with 23 in such a fine, science of epigenetics. Impossible. But we found something around the cortisol receptor, gene regions, that there was an area that was linked to the shift. And for me, that coming at it from my kind of ceremonial perspective, I was very interested because initially we had a hard time finding the change. And then we said, no, let's not look at, because, there's this kind of first level of understanding epigenetics, this idea of methylation of the DNA strand of these different regions, that there would be like these gene regions that they would have a hypermethylation or, more methylation or less methylation, that it would be as simple as that. I found that from my experience just in biology and my experience on the Amazon, that seemed very hard to believe to me, that it was just going to be up, down. When people are talking about epigenetic memories of, trauma stories that are somehow going to be, programmed into a system on up, down. So I said, no, just look at change in general. Who changed the most, up or down? We don't care. And it's probably more complex than that. We need more increased processing to explore this very, very amazing biological machinery. And if you do that, you start saying, okay, these guys, some of them are going up, some of them are going down. I said, that's when we saw the separation. The people who had improved, CAP scores, the PTSD scales improved was linked to these epigenetic changes, certain gene regions that are related to the cortisol receptor. So that was the big study that we published last year, and that's what I wanted to share with you all related to what I was talking about. So I hope that's helpful, and I'm curious to hear questions. I don't know if I answered your question, but I tried.
That was great. Can you force this type of psychotherapy onto somebody? But one thing that strikes me as a potential parameter of psychotherapy is that the willingness of the subject.
Yes.
They're very willing.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're desperate. Somebody who, I don't know, could you take Donald Trump and put him in,
Right.
give him psychotherapy and make him a good person? Probably not, but so setting. So you've got the template of openness, willingness, I want to get an effect. Does that bias, and bias doesn't mean a bad thing, but is that a component of the foundation, the launch for success?
Well, I mean, they have that in the case of the MAP study, randomized double-blind study, where they try to address that. So then you have people who are expecting to get it, and then they don't get it. They don't know if they got it or they did, and I guess they can figure out that they didn't get it, early on. But they see a big separation of the people that got the MDMA versus the ones that didn't. Like that's clear. So it's not as simple as just the expectation. I mean, I think then we have the other data around the neuroplasticity that is opening up for people. Like this is a biological pharmacologic factor that's real. That's being studied in animals, these mouse studies. That's just like, well, what is the expectation value for the mouse? And yet they're seeing these ability to relearn social interactions that they were stuck. They could no longer learn. I'm talking about Gold Dolan's work, neuroscience researcher. where they have, I'm not an expert of this, but this is what I understand. I've talked to her about it. You know, these mice that there are certain windows of development where they can learn these certain social interaction skills. And if they pass that window of development and they didn't learn it, then they lost that. And they can't relearn it. They haven't been able to teach them to relearn it. And so that's this idea of these critical window periods, like in emotional development for human beings, that you would have, you know, attachment disorder related to, hey, if you didn't get this at this age, then that's going to get wired into your emotional function long term. And so how do you, or if you had a very serious trauma that maybe reopened the window period, to mark that, to condition the system to adapt to such an intense, you know, situation, to be able to avoid any future type of circumstance. So when they look at that, and then they do with mice, with MDMA in this case, they see they're open to open a window again. And now they can bring them around the other mice and they're going to learn these skills that they could not. So now there's more neuroplasticity available to them to relearn things that they had been shut off from learning. So that's an example of something that's pharmacologic as far as we know, you know, that is an added benefit of the psychedelic treatment. Is that window further facilitated by some of the other things we just talked about? You know, I think probably yes.
I mean, is that a generalized effect? I mean, we're talking to Rael about this of I study neuroplasticity in the context of cognitive circuits and motor circuits in mice, cells, humans, mostly like Parkinson's. But one thing one of my questions is this a generalized phenomena that we see where you just basically through the psychedelic lower the threshold for, let's just say, LTP, neuroplasticity, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Many mechanisms involved here, that you lower the threshold. And what you do now is that you've lowered the threshold, you've gone back to the pre-critical period of life, of visual system, of emotional systems, whatever that might be. And now by lowering that threshold, you now make it a template for experience. And that's what the shaman does, that's what the psychotherapist does, that's what the trip does for some people.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I'd love to do, Rael, just all we need is time, money, and a few other things, but those is to just say, does this a general brain effect? So therefore, I should be able to repair the motor system that I break in my animal models by administering these types of drugs, because that threshold, the enhancement of neuroplasticity, has now been restored. Because there's nothing unique about cognitive circuits, emotional circuits, motor circuits. They're neurons with connections.
Right.
And so that I think would be fascinating to look at.
An interesting thing on that, sorry, but just to elaborate a little, like the thing that your animal model work could do to really usefully provide evidence for the model that Joe's presenting, the model that I spoke about, adjacent, not exactly the same, but similar theme, is, you know, in animals, you can't teach them to meditate. We don't know how to do it. But you can have animals in enriched natural-like environments versus man-made, sterile, you know, boxy, straight-edged environments. And I would imagine that an enriched natural-like environment with plants growing in the little cage, whatever size cage you choose, would actually mimic some of the effects that spiritual healing practices are able to do with the human system. And of course, that natural environments also do produce for the humans as well, but it's not as easy to engage in those kinds of top-down efforts to encourage bottom-up presence in animal models unless you go to these basics.
Yeah, but maybe what we're talking about is, you know, their level of emotional homeostasis is here. Our level of homeostasis, emotional, is here. And PTSD takes us off this, depression takes us off this. And these psychotherapeutic modalities bring you back to, let's call it the normalcy. And one thing that's always struck me as interesting is the fact that the experience itself guides you into restoration of, that's called normalcy or whatever it may be. And that's as simple as confession. And for, you know, I grew up Catholic. I'm not a big practicing person of any religions anymore, except if there's food involved. But the idea that confessions really removes stress, because now you've got peace. And one thing another thing that always struck me as really fascinating quickly is the whole idea of creating links between things. like you talk about community, about linking to the nature, to the world, to whatever. Jonathan Gold in his City of Gold documentary, Food, talks about the link between humans is just sharing a meal. And I thought this was a fascinating, you don't have to share a psychedelic or load the bong. You could just have a meal.
Yes.
And it creates bonds between us. Stress goes down, acceptance goes up,
Yes.
forgiveness, gratitude goes up. All these things that you talk about are restored, which is almost like that's what we normally should be doing. But now in our new world, we're robbed of this, these types of things. So I
Well,
thought
and
that's-
so then it's kind of like the one of the hopes is, and just like to your friend, I think like Gold Dolan, you should talk to her, this neuroscientist that has these animal models with MDMA and all. She's testing all the psychedelics. So as far as rewire, she would be somebody more expert and we could connect you to her. It would be interesting. She'd probably really like to learn about what you're doing. That's one thing. But then the idea is that this psychedelic psychotherapy, what we're learning about it is not so much that everyone needs to do it, but it's like we're learning, hey, these things are really valuable to health. To the point that it could turn around somebody out of anxiety or depression or PTSD. So how do we demonstrate more value around this, the need for community, the need for, well, it's the psychedelic research that's showing this connectedness, linking it, that's one of the sources of research that's really bringing this to the forefront. So that's the goal, is that we would just be living a healthier culture, but the culture is disconnected from those things, and that's hard on us.
Does the methylation signal predict efficacy of other interventions, or is it specific to the mechanism?
They're looking at it for psychotherapy. So I mean, as far as, it's not really at a point where you can predict. I mean, it's very observational. You're just trying to capture. So they haven't dialed it into where you say, oh, this region, if you see the shift, this was like the first publication of this kind. They have done some around psychotherapy intervention and trying to see shifts with methylation signal.
And also a question about, so the masters in that kind of specialized class, I guess you call them in that society, and they're are you doing some form of I guess domestication, or has there been some like artificial selection where you're unintentionally maybe selecting for strains that have or inducing more complex pharmacologies than you'd find in, say, North American plant or something like that?
Not as much as the North American. I mean, more in the subtle like range of like, what they've done. I'm sure there's some degree of that. To what degree? It's not like what, I mean, that's a Western, like it's an American, that's happening in Hawaii with ayahuasca. In the Amazon, they're just not as interested in that. But as soon as the ayahuasca started growing in Hawaii, they started finding strains. Oh, if we do this, we can get a higher DMT content. They would prefer to deal with the natural version of that. Oh, well, that one was really strong. Oh, the other one's not as strong. So it's not just aiming for the, that's a materialistic perspective that they don't share.
Do the shamans only use ayahuasca in their ceremonies, or do they also apply other methods like based on the person, like meditation?
Yeah, it depends on there's many different schools of shamanism or traditional healing in Peru or across the Amazon. So among the ones that work with ayahuasca, then within that, there's a big range. So at our center, for example, the primary treatment intervention is considered the diet. So the idea of being in spiritual retreat on a very restrictive diet and a lot of isolation, very meditative. The most advanced is they sit alone in a hut and no one talks to them. They bring them their food. So that's that. That person, whether or not they come to ayahuasca ceremony, then they come to ceremony to be treated, to add to their process. That person's also going to be given plant medicine that's not psychedelic, not psychoactive, to support their healing, maybe physically or maybe to support them, homeopathically, spiritually. There could be topical treatments that are being used, plant poultices and things like that, or vapor treatments or vomitive treatments, kind of like Ayurveda or something, just wider herbal medicine practice. And then as far as different kinds of spiritual practice or meditation, I mean, that would depend on the teacher, that many times it's very natural. They don't say, oh, meditate in this way. Just go sit in your room for a month.
I asked because of that stat that you showed that 36% said that particularly the shaman was what made a big difference.
Right. So then their training is particular. So these are people trained shamans and healers. So the shaman, what is so significant about that person? Like, well, you have their training, which is very mystically oriented. I went through the training, so it's just like prolonged periods of time in this restrictive diets in the jungle to connect to the plants and to learn how to channel the energy that way. You know, it's very strange and mystical, but you know, just like the meditators, the people living in a cave for 10 years, I mean, they have something to share that the other person who hasn't done it can't really tell you, you know? So it's like, it sounds weird, it sounds weird, but go do it and see, and then, or go watch them do what they do, which is what happened to me. You know, I go down to the Amazon, I see them singing to people and changing things around for people, and you're just blown away. You're like, oh my God, I didn't know you could do this. And they say, oh, well, this is how you learn.
They didn't teach us this in medical school.
No, they didn't. But Raul was teaching meditation classes in our medical school. We did, and I went. But there is some degree of talent. You know, so it's like, oh, just like medical school, they don't let everyone go to medical school. They try to find the ones they think are gonna perform well. So the teachers tries to find, oh, this person, maybe they're good for this. And then there's dedication, and then there's practice, and then there's experience. You know, you don't go to the shaman, this is the first time they've ever treated that problem. Ricardo, when somebody, he has like, we just helped somebody like you last week. You know, I'm not telling you I'm telling you because I just did it. I know you think it's impossible. I helped somebody last week, so experience. So then the idea is many years of experience. So they add this study, I know the shamans that work, some of them that were studied in that study, these people have significant experience. You know,
Like, I wonder if we would have some of these outcomes with those shamans or well-trained shamans without the ayahuasca, I guess is what I'm getting at.
well, so it all depends on this, what we were talking about before is the openness of the person. So the openness and the willingness of the person and the plasticity factor, that's
That makes
there.
sense.
When somebody is very open, the traditional people patient, they don't expect them to drink ayahuasca in the ceremony.
I see.
They're gonna come, they're open to receive the energetic healing, they're open to go through the whole thing. And they believe in it, but they would go as far to say, no, they think something actually happened metaphysically that's gonna affect their body. So then, for me, so then working with people with ketamine, you know, so I learned to sing that way. And it's like, okay, so now what if I drink it in ceremony to sing like that, but now I don't. So now I just learn it to learn it. And now, what about singing to people on ketamine? Well, they're on ketamine. If I sing to somebody on who's never done it, ketamine, and they've never heard the songs, they might think it's cool. They might, I don't know, hard to tell. But if you get them on ketamine and do it, they're like, whoa. So there's an openness that if they were already open to appreciate that energetically, maybe it wouldn't make such a difference. You know, maybe we wouldn't need it. But the idea is it facilitates that openness somehow, which is the same thing with, you know, this. You know, you have psychotherapy without MDMA, psychotherapy with MDMA. I'm not saying everyone should do it. I don't, I'm not a proponent of that. I don't think it's a panacea, but it's just a very interesting option for people that are stuck. These people have been 20 years treatment-resistant chronic PTSD. If you're a medical student like us and you go to the VA and you're training, there's guys from Vietnam there. They're still there. You know, you go to my friend, in the book, I talk about a Vietnam vet that we took to Peru. He's in his 60s. And he says, oh, I just went to the group therapy. They have the guys from Iraq and Afghanistan showing up to the small, you know, and they look at me and they say, oh my God, I'm gonna be here for the rest of my life. You know, and the doctor, how do they teach us? Yeah, you probably will, you know? So it's like, so then there's some situations, so this idea of this deconditioning, that there's some things that can be very heavily conditioned in the system, heavy trauma, you know, how far back can we open things up again, the possibilities of the living system? You know, whether it's, you know, Parkinson's or, you know, nerve damage, you know, how much play is there with that? With this stuff, we've demonstrated there's a lot more room than we thought. This person, PTSD, this sexual abuse as a child, they told us they're not gonna get better. You know, so I'm not saying that everybody should do psychedelics or sacred plant medicine is so important. So I'm saying, no, they told me to forget that person. Let's move to the next one. We can help the next one. So those are real people and these are real problems, and this difficulty of addressing trauma, heavy trauma, or different degrees of conditioning that affect all of us. That this is an opportunity to say, oh, maybe we could open that back up again, reprocess that a little bit, maybe rewire the story, within the system again, and then create a culture that would help strengthen the conditioning around that. That they wouldn't just kind of dilute back into whatever, So there's room for what you're saying, for sure. And so then, but then that's how they say, okay, the other version of that is what we talked about of people that are really spiritually prepared or, advanced meditators. Even Rael did this in Switzerland, and they went on to continue doing that, and they made a documentary called Descending the Mountain online, and where they have advanced Zen meditators from Switzerland that have them do mushrooms. None of them had a bad experience. They're all prepared to let go and dissolve and go into it, and they had beautiful experiences. The nun among them, Sister Teresa, I don't know if you ever met her, but she's part of the movie. I enjoyed listening to her. And she said, after a lifetime, you hear her, she is like the real, it's like, what has she been doing with her time? She's like, well, I was, working with the destitute over here. And then I went over here to work at this home for the prostitutes. And then I was over here, for decades. Like, it is a saint, by with those kind of measures. Like, this is an unusual person. And they asked her, how was it? She said, oh, it's very beautiful. It's nothing new. It doesn't bring us anything new. It's a midwife to help us, access what's there. So that's our point. That's my point, is that like the psychedelic clinical renaissance is shining the light on spirituality, on this mystical dimension of life, whatever that is, that it's there, that it's something to address. We could say before they said the black hole isn't real, and now they took a picture of it. And so that's a region of space-time. That's a fourth dimensional object. They said the photons can entangle themselves. That's crazy, And I said, actually, no, and that's the basis of quantum computing, which is actually fueling the artificial intelligence. So like the very mystical nature of matter is integral to our functioning at the computer level, but more obviously within our biology. The consciousness itself from a brain or related to the brain. Yeah, did you have a question or no? Back there, Liz? No? Okay. Yes.
So as well as psychospiritual psychotherapy training and computational neurobiology training, I'm also trained in theoretical physics at Cambridge. And it's natural in a medical school that the model of consciousness sort of defaults to being a property of the brain, and therefore the only mode of action of psychedelics that can really take place is molecular biological, right? But you did mention, there was one sentence in there where you said something about matter, time, energy, and consciousness.
Right.
And I'm just interested, like my own intuition is that we actually need to redevelop science in a very fundamental level, where the relationship between life and matter is looked at very differently. In your experience, or I don't know if the traditional people would talk about this, do you share that intuition? Do you see the sort of materialist brain basis of consciousness as a barrier to understanding?
Hamstrung.
Hamstrung.
Yes, a good British.
Yeah, I felt
That's my
like-
best English.
I feel a little sort of restricted even asking the question.
No,
in this
but
esteemed
there-
academic
I,
setting.
no, well, no, but I mean, we're at the Mindfulness Center, it's
Okay,
like,
so it's okay.
yeah,
Okay,
it's
right?
more than
It
okay.
is encouraged.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's more than okay. It's
I didn't break the sentence.
no, it's freedom from ignorance
That's
is
the
what
one.
you're describing.
Yeah.
So the materialist model is limited. And we run into the edges of it in theoretical physics. We run into the edges of it in Western
neuroscience.
medicine, in neuroscience.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, so I would go as far to say this, that this is what they would say down there.
Thank you.
Okay,
That's what I
that's
wanted.
what it is. I can help. This is finally, I can just blab, but here's something unique maybe that you'd ever been down there in the Amazon and watching people come down, some people, professors from medical schools, maybe it's very materialistic, like focused. my experience is that that kind of thinking is generally like this top down. I was talking to Jonas about it, this top down, default mode network kind of hyperconnectivity, maybe you could call it, or this top down functioning is there, the leaning in on it, the really digging in on it, and the kind of absolutely no room for any the immaterial in the discussion is coming from a wounded place.
Yeah.
And because if we open up the other way, if we go bottom up, and let them go on to these, the default mode network connectivity, we close it down, say, hey, you're not gonna be able to use your ego and your wits about you, they're not gonna be so available to you. And then we see a lot of emotional content come forward consistently. A lot of somatic content, a lot of stuff come forward. And so what I see, this is my impression, is when I can judge that person and I can be hard on them and say, oh, you're just, but it's really like, it's a compassion that developed for me over time there, because that person very consistently, if they stay down there and do the diet for 2 weeks, go through ayahuasca ceremony and submit themselves to this process with the shamans, they would start opening up to the mystical side of, they would come and have no visions. That was like psychedelic, who cares, what's the problem? That's nothing. And then, okay, we'll stay, first night, second night, third night. I'm talking like a very high percentage. This is my personal experience, I've published like 90 percentile, almost everyone, they're gonna, oh my God, like, I think I just spoke with God last night.
There's something else.
There's something else.
Yeah.
So what was the key to helping that person out of a materialism that is in denial? I would go as far to say of something else.
Yeah.
And so it turns out the denial of something else, it would seem, is related to never having been held in enough safety to be vulnerable enough and free from judgment to experience, So if you're in an academic setting, I went to medical school at UCSD, which was a very rigid setting.
Yeah.
You are familiar.
I was there.
You were at Cambridge, you were at UCSD. I don't know if you Cambridge, but UCSD was uncomfortable. If you
The
have
Department of Applied Math and Theoretical Physics in Cambridge, the tea room of Stephen Hawking sitting over in
Yeah.
the corner. Let's say there's a certain rigidity there.
Let's say, Andrew was my co-PhD student at UCSD neuroscience.
So you're
That's how it
familiar.
works.
Yeah.
And so that environment for me, with my sensibility from my family, Colombian family, was just, whoa, are they okay? When they come off the plane to the Amazon and the motor taxi driver drops the guy off to me, who looks like, to me, I would say that's an average American. This guy has a career, I guess that's what my diagnosis, he looks a little stressed out. They would say, what's wrong with him? And so this disconnection.
Right.
This disconnection the materialism allows the abstraction to say, this is not, what I'm feeling in my body doesn't matter. What I'm feeling in my emotions is not relevant. We just charge on through, but then the body starts breaking down. The mental health starts breaking down. So that's the hamstrung part of it. That's the concern, is that I'm sorry, sir, that's not working out that way. It's actually the physiology is not responding to what you're describing to me of how things work. And so then as we hold them in that space, so then in these environments, like at UCSD, was not a place where vulnerability, if I tell them I'm having a hard time, they called me in to say, oh, we're gonna put it in your dean's letter, this like vampire. It's like, well, can you tell me what was going on? Can you explain to me what was, I don't really feel like talking to you. Well, then maybe I need to put something in your letter and tell the residencies that you're kind of a depressive person. That's what happened to me. So then as soon as that conversation happened, I said, you know what, you can put whatever you want in my letter, as far as I'm concerned, because it's like, you don't care about me at all. And so it's like, what's going on here? So that was a very
Training the healers. Training the healers.
So then the healers are being, it's being beaten out of them. You know, and there's an element of becoming a doctor that there's a vulnerability that's just, it's too hard to maintain. You know, that's the other, that's what they're coming from that side. They say, hey, you look, we gotta toughen up here. We can't go there all the time because somebody just died and now somebody's gonna die and we gotta go over there. I think the guy's gonna die. You know, that starts, you start getting exposed to that regularly. And so there's room, I have compassion for that, but to realize that conditioning could paint you into a corner and make you dig into materialism, maybe partially because you don't want to go there. Like, we're not gonna go there. And that was the vibe of the academic setting. Like, it's like, we're not gonna go there. It's not from an emotional standpoint. I would say that was my experience.
Right, but I think, I'm not I don't believe there's a materialistic separation from spirituality. I think it is an intrinsic property of the brain.
Yes.
But exactly what you said, and that's a compliment actually, because that's good, because we can live with this. One thing that strikes me as really quite fascinating is your discussion of healing in the context of psychotherapy is exactly the paradigm struggle we went through with Parkinson's disease 30 years ago, 25 years ago. The whole idea of physical, now we have what's called neurophysical therapy, neuro-PT. It didn't exist because no one believed that the brain had anything to do with physical therapy. You just had to mechanically move those things that aren't working in order to restore them. Turns out that's not the case at all. And after 25 years of struggle and 25 years and 50, 100 papers, whatever it might be, now, primarily because I've been told the work that we've been doing and my colleagues is that exercise, physical therapy is a standard of care for Parkinson's patients. But one thing that we found really fascinating very, very early was the importance of state of mind. And that exactly the patients, and Giselle pointed this out to me, Giselle Petzinger, my colleague, pointed out to me, those patients that are optimized on their drug, meaning they're not dementing, or not cognitively impaired or not over treated, are actually benefiting from the intervention, which at that time was body weight supported treadmill and physical therapy, which says to me that if you create this link between mind, brain, and body, you'll get the benefits from it. You'll get healing. It doesn't cure the disease. We can't stop the disease, but we can change the disease course from 6 years to now 30 years, and which I think is pretty significant.
Yes.
Giselle's got patients who are 30 years into the disorders and don't have walkers. That's pretty amazing. And so that really says to me, I'm trying to look for the unifying theory of your work and all the work that I do with some of my colleagues in the room here, and my own work, is the idea that healing, and it's still taught in the medical school, the lack of the importance of physical therapy. And in fact, Keck just removed a few years, like last year, physical therapy from the hospital because it's not useful. You can't bill it it's not important. And the most you can get from an insurance company is maybe 2 weeks, 4 if you really scream at them. But then again, physical therapy, it's like eating, it's like spirituality, it's a lifelong journey. You can't just start with 2 weeks and then go home.
Right.
You have to continue. And I think there's a lot of important unifying theories between all these fields in our understanding of the brain-body interactions. And I think this is absolutely fascinating. And I don't think we've solved it all yet, but maybe we will over dinner, I think. But I think it's actually remarkable. And I really, it helps us thinking. And I really think we have to get at mechanism. I'm mechanistically driven, and I know there's mechanisms. There's imaging, which would be really valuable. There's neuroplasticity, which would be incredibly valuable. Animal models can actually give us a lot of insight. Your whole idea of looking at the epigenetic phenomena. I was on the website this morning with NIDA, and everything is epigenetics. It's amazing, everything. You can pick it up everywhere. It's like the experience of addiction versus non-addictive.
We presented the idea a few years ago to the National Institute of Mental Health. They were like, oh, come on, that's not.
We presented exercise to Parkinson's disease
Very
patients
arbitrary.
in 1995, and we could not get it funded. They said, what has exercise? The brain does not change, it's dying. Why would you even think of putting a patient on a treadmill? You can't get them on there. And I run the marathon with a guy who's 74 years old, and he's had Parkinson's, he was 37. Tell me what's on. So I think there's some amazing mechanistic as well as other crosstalk between these fields, which I think is really exciting.
We were talking about just briefly with Sal, because with Parkinson's and music and dance, right? And that the role of that to somehow support further, the recovery. I guess we have to wrap this up.
Yeah, after this.
You know, but I'm very interested in that because then because one of the areas, and it's not the answer, but it's another interesting is this brain entropy piece of this like brain entropy related to, and that's a consciousness piece in a way. I don't know how that happens in the animals, but that somehow being open to this more creative kind of the muse of energy, or that the music can kind of open this, whether it's somatic, I don't know what's driving it, you know, but the brain entropy is something that's measurable, that's curious. And just seeing it, does that play a role in the,
Internetwork connectivity.
yeah,
I agree completely. There's a basis for it. I think it's so about, which I think is good. It's sad because it's not as dramatic, but yet it's valuable to those patients so that we can have even better evidence-based medicine, patients that are resistant or patients that it's just not working. What do we need to do?
right.
You know, is there going to be DBS for forgiveness? I don't know, but just it's amazing. The opportunities are just amazing.
Just to finish on that one point, like confession and forgiveness and the interconnectivity, I don't know how what did you call it? What was your term?
Internetwork.
Internetwork connectivity. So then on the spiritual kind of journey, the idea of achieving more of that state of mind would be, you know, acceptance.
Yeah, is that the dream state?
Acceptance. And so acceptance and the forgiveness, when we're at the ceremony down there and somebody decides to share something very personal in front of the group in a form of confession, and no one's been pushed into that, but if they decide to do it, says, you know, that's really great, because when you share like that, then you forgive yourself. You just allow yourself to be, I'm accepting myself here, saying this thing happened. And then you release, now the connectivity opens again. You know, the compartmentalization that you were dealing with inside, it's like you've let that loose. I don't know.
We can map that.
It's
Right? You guys
given
can.
it's about
Maybe.
1:30. I apologize for this is a great talk. Thank you, Joe, once again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
And I'll just say two quick words. One, bringing it back to acceptance at the end and forgiveness. But, you know, mindfulness can very usefully be boiled down to present moment, accepting, loving awareness. You know, it's about awareness and acceptance and nothing more. And of course, that loving quality, if you're not turning toward your experience with some sense of love and care, that's not really mindfulness. So, you know, we're speaking about the same stuff, whether it's in the mindfulness field or the psychedelic field, it's pointing to the same direction. And I'm really glad, you know, we've now this year been hosting so many speakers on the psychedelic front, because it's, I think, so important for the field of mindfulness science to be informed by the psychedelic science and vice versa. Joe will be speaking again tomorrow on the medical school campus from 12 to 1. And really appreciate everyone's participation, both in person and virtually. And look forward to seeing you again soon.
I want to, I brought these books, but whoever showed up, I want to give you a book if you will take it, just to share, just because it's nice to have you here and just to share the ideas. And this ideas from the jungle. If you're interested, come get a book. I'll give you a book. Okay. All right. Thanks for coming. Oh.